Right, so I'm Dave Hounslow. I'm a consultant developer, and I'm going to talk to you today about a company I was involved with recently that we're going through a kind of an agile transformation. And one of the things that I picked up on this was that actually they were using a feature branching style of development, and we moved to a trunk or mainline style of development. And I want to pick up on how this had some impact on some of the ways the team worked. So first of all, I wanted to talk about one of the things that the continuous delivery book says about your branching model. And thanks, Jez, for saying this earlier today as well. This kind of runs as a theme for the core of the continuous delivery book, is that every developer should be committing frequently to this mainline trunk, and we should keep that always releasable. And that's really at the core, I think, of continuous delivery. And by committing frequently, I know that quite often it's quoted as being at least once a day. I personally think that at least once a day is really the bare minimum. If you should really be committing 3, 4, 5 times a day, every couple of hours, you should be committing into your main line. And so let's talk about this project I was working with. So this company has a product called the Loop Energy Monitor, and this is a user-installed energy monitor device that monitors both your electricity and your gas, and they provide various feedback of how much energy you're using in real time, but also they're not tied to any particular vendor, so one of the key things they're able to do is offer a switching deal so that you can switch to it will actually tell you switch to a different supplier. Now, they were using a branching model, which I don't think, to be fair, anybody would actually recommend. It came in 2 parts, and one part was reasonably conventional, which was this, which is, you may have seen this diagram before, a Git flow type approach to branching. I must admit, my first reaction when I saw this was, wow, that looks complicated. And is this really the simplest thing that could possibly work? But we were loosely based on this. I have to say it wasn't entirely Git flow, but the approach, if you haven't come across this before, is basically you have a develop branch. When your developer wants to work on a particular issue or feature, they will create their own branch for that issue or feature. They'll work on that until it's done. They'll then merge that back into the develop branch. Develop branch then gets used for the testing, integration testing. And when we're happy with that develop branch, that gets merged back into the release branch, and the release branch is what you actually release from. So this is actually fairly conventional. Lots of people are using this. The thing that was slightly unconventional is we were also working with a third-party vendor. And that third-party vendor we're actually using Subversion, interestingly, not Git, which we were using Git internally. And they were essentially, we were working on kind of 4-week iterations, and about once an iteration, they would drop on us a release. And it did feel like this to the internal development team. And no disrespect to the external development team, they were perfectly competent technical people, but basically it felt like they would drop this Subversion bomb on us, and we'd have to integrate that into the develop branch and actually get that thing released. It caused us quite a lot of headaches. I think it's fair to say that releases were quite stressful, and we really felt that we needed to try and do something different. I think the other thing that's worth saying here as well, it really did create a bit of an us and them culture between the 2 teams. So it really didn't feel like we were working together. So the big thing that was coming onto this, as I say, this is an energy monitor company, and they had already got their electricity device out in the field, but they were bringing on this gas monitoring as well. And this is actually going to be a fairly major piece of work. And it was probably going to take, by estimates, to get all of the pieces done, about 3 to 6 months. And it was also going to need some quite close collaboration between these 2 teams, where they'd previously been able to work reasonably separately because of the way the work had been structured. And I should say the external team largely responsible for the web front end, the internal team largely responsible for the back end that was kind of talking to these devices. So this was their plan, was to do a 3 to 6 month feature branch for gas. Now, my immediate reaction to this was, I'd previously worked with Dave Farley actually on the Almax project, which is one of his the really slick continuous delivery operation, and I hoped that we could move more in this direction. So, what was the plan? So what we were doing, we were feature branching, we were doing 4-week, roughly, iterations, and we were getting a release out about every 3 months. And so this is what we suggested we do. We're going to move to mainline development. We're going to do 2-week iterations, and we're going to release every iteration. And people started to say things like, well, what about regression testing? Frankly, at the moment, we're doing a 3-month release cycle, and we barely managed to do our full regression test in that cycle. And I would argue, actually, we weren't doing a full regression test because actually our releases often went out, had about half a dozen hot fixes before the system was actually functional again. They also said, well, how are we going to do code reviews? If people are committing to mainline all the time like this, how are we going to review that code before it gets actually integrated into release? And we're not going to write such good code. We're going to be rushing it. We take our time at the moment. We plan it. We design it up front. We spend 4 weeks, getting this excellent code together. So I think, and these are genuine concerns that people in the team raised. And so look about some of the behaviours that changed as a result of doing this. Let's first of all talk about testing. So it's perfectly reasonable for people to say, well, we had some automatic tests, but largely this was manual testing. And this fact that we were struggling, therefore, to get things through. And I think my point is, if you move to a always releasable trunk that your developers are frequently committing to, and you're committing to actually getting a release out every 2 weeks, then really there is no choice but to automate your regression testing. So the very fact that you've moved to this branching model is actually pushing you down that path. And so this is what we did. We used an approach which I think you may have heard of before. People call it lighting the path, because we didn't have a full regression test suite. So each area of functionality we went into and touched, we started to write those regression tests. First of all, to prove that the functionality there was fully tested. And then as we introduced new functionality, we wrote tests for those. When those tests went green, then we knew we were ready to go. So this was the other thing. So we were doing code reviews on each thing before it went into release. And this works fine if you are working on a branch that you're perhaps going to work on for a day or more. Quite often, although some discipline was tried to try and get things that we wouldn't do that. Even in the feature branching model, we tried to keep it down to 3-4 days. It tended to creep. And if you're doing code reviews, you issue a pull request. After a couple of days of work, you move on to something else. At some point, asynchronously, somebody comes back to you with a few suggestions, perhaps wants to chat to you for a bit. You make a few modifications and you move on. If you're committing to a main line every couple of hours, this starts to gradually look quite a lot like pairing anyway, because you're spending quite a lot of time actually working with those individuals. And what we found was that you may as well just go and do pairing. So we had that choice, essentially. You could decide, actually, I don't need that second pair of eyes. But we decided we wanted to. And we took on pair programming, which I was very pleased about, because I'm a big fan of pair programming. And it proved to be very successful. Somebody mentioned in a just a question previously about how you talk about losing important members of the team, by the way. Pairing is a really good way to deal with this, because if you do pairing and pair rotation, you actually end up with not being over-dependent on any one individual. And we actually lost one of the key technical guys during this process, and we barely noticed they'd gone. It was a shame because they were technically great, but once you've got pairing under full flow, you find that you're much more robust to losing those key staff. So the next thing I want to talk about is this idea that the code base and the code wouldn't be as good because we were rushing things. Now, I'm sure a lot of those people that here developers will think that refactoring is an incredibly important part of keeping your code base clean. And we have one guy in particular who was quite resistant to this approach. It always worked in a feature branching type development. And he said, you know, I don't want to commit things until they're done. I fiddle with them, I change them a lot, and I want them ready. But to his credit, he came on board and he committed to doing this different approach. And it's about 3 or 4 months in, and I think he had a bit of an aha moment. He was trying to do a refactor. It wasn't a huge refactor, but it was a little bit more than just a basic, you know, in your IDE, rename something, commit. I think he had a class that he wanted to break into a couple of classes, change the interface a little bit, something like that. And it was something that was used by a number of different parts of the system. And it was also one of these things, a bit of a utility class was likely to get used by somebody else during the course of that process if that had gone on for a few days. And he managed to break this down into a couple of bits. So he, first of all, did the new implementation, committed that, and then he was able to start wiring in and committed in several phases. And he said, having done this, he just sort of completed it and said, wow, this is awesome. I can refactor without upsetting my teammates. Because he said, you know, previously, if I'd have done this, he said, do you know what? I might have got the refactor done, but I'd have actually got 2 or 3 days down the road, my teammates would have come banging on the door and saying, come on, what have you done with this class? I was using that. And so I think refactoring is really hard and really important. And anything that makes it more difficult is a bad idea. So I think that this benefit of refactoring, because of the trunk-based development, is really useful. Now, the other thing that I mentioned at the start is this fact that we had this us and them team. And I think one of the problems that we had is that each part of the team, almost down to the individual developer, very much focused on their story, what they're delivering at the moment. And one of the benefits, I think, of changing this focus onto your main line is you end up focusing on just that one thing. We're all delivering this one product. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of a Formula One pit crew, but it's pretty obvious here what the focus of the attention is. We're working on releasing this car, right? And one of the things I noticed when I got this slide up, actually, there's an awful lot of pairing going on in this photograph as well. And if you've worked on a really efficient, continuous delivery team, it feels a lot like this, actually. But you need something that brings this same focus that the car brings. And for me, that's these big feedback screens, these information radiators. And one of the first things we were able to do was, yes, we've got red on here, I know, it's not always green, was actually have these same shared screens between these 2 separate areas. We're actually physically located on separate sites. And having this common point of reference with a single CI environment actually meant that we were able to say, whoa, hang on a minute, the build's broken. And people would immediately, having not really spoken to people other than, oh, you dumped this pile of stuff on us today and it's rubbish, it doesn't work. We were immediately picking up the phone, oh, you've just checked in such and such. I can see what you've done. I've had a look. I think this is the fix. And communication almost overnight actually massively increased between these two sites and started to make us feel like we were all working together. This bottom feedback screen here, by the way, is something that I find really useful, which is doing you actually have by test and build when it failed. And you find that this is a really good way of spotting if you've got intermittency or whether you've got one thing. You can see, you quite quickly spot patterns and say, oh, these 4 tests have failed. I kind of know what's going on there. Right. So where are we today? So the end result of this actually is that they're no longer split across 2 sites. As I say, I'm no longer working with these guys, but I went and saw them, and I actually saw them on a lunchtime, which is why this office is so empty. But everybody's pairing, lots of feedback, and our product owner there, Andy, he claimed we were 1,000% more productive. Now, I asked him for detailed metrics on that, and he was unable to provide them. So just to recap the result, we were feature branching, we were releasing every 3 to 4 months, 4-week iterations, we were doing code reviews, we had actually a deteriorating code base, it wasn't getting better, the team was divided, we brought in mainline development and continuous delivery. They're now releasing 2 to 3 times a week. Everybody's pairing, the code base is actually improving all the time, and the team is physically united, not just united in spirit. And I think to sum up is that I think that if you're using this feature branching, non-mainline approach, it's very possible you're at risk of just doing agile and that old cargo cult style approach. I'm not saying you are, but I think it's possible. I think that if you switch to mainline and with this always loose things, you can't. I really genuinely think you cannot do this without being agile, and I think that's the key thing. So that's me. Thanks very much. I've got time for some questions. I've got loads of time for questions. I've obviously spoke way too fast.
Okay. It's really hard to do this, and what we've struggled with is when we're making a change, which we think we have to do 6 months worth of work, otherwise it'll break everything. And I guess what's the silver bullet there for that? I guess the challenge is to try and work out. If it's going to break everything, is it best? Well, if it's going to break anyway, you might as well have it broken and gradually get it working again. Or because often, I'm a huge fan of all this stuff. That's why I'm here. But the reality sometimes, when you look at it and you think, I've got a big infrastructure change. I'm going to fundamentally change the way this works. How do I do that where we can deliver every month, never mind every day? So. Have you got any advice or any tips?
So a couple of things that we worked on to really try and crack this problem. First of all, talk about this gas implementation, which was a fairly major reworking of the way the software works, and this idea that we're going to do this feature branch to start with. Actually, when we said, well, no, we're not going to do a feature branch, we said, what are our alternatives? And it turned out that it was really quite straightforward for us to simply say, do you know what? We actually have a really good feature toggle that's available here. Physically, if we don't send them this gas device, they can't use it. So we just went ahead and implemented the whole thing, including the registration, etc. And it actually generated some interest from customers saying, oh, how do I get one of these gas devices? So that's how we dealt with that particular issue. I guess the other thing that we really concentrated on as well, which is interesting to see from Jez's talk that it wasn't actually felt to be that critical, is that working on automating the deployment made a huge difference to us, because that actually pulled out a lot of the issues around how do I make these infrastructure changes, how do I make fundamental changes in a fully automated way. We went to full blue-green deployments in AWS, where we were actually able to literally do the new release, test it with the actual data that's in production, do a quick check through everything is okay, and then flick over. I guess we were privileged in the fact that we didn't have to be up 24/7 and people weren't going to notice. Although we've got these devices continually communicating, our user pattern was fairly kind of regular in that most users use it every day, but only for sort of 20 minutes a day, and so they didn't notice if it was down for 20 minutes in the middle of the day. Does that help?
I've got a question. So my question is related to pair programming. And you said you're a big fan of it. How does it work out in terms of cost? So for in short term and in long term? And how would you say is your team a small team, medium team, or a large team?
So I'll address the second part of that first.
Okay.
So the team that we were, this particular team was, I would say, quite small. So we had 6 to 8 developers at any one time. When we started pairing with the external agency, it went up and down a bit because we didn't actually have them all full time, which interesting actually. We didn't really realise that until we did this. We paid for a certain number of days from the agency, and what we didn't realise is that we didn't get the same people every day. I have done this on much bigger teams as well, and in terms of cost, it's one of those things that is extremely difficult to quantify, but I think because the payback is not simply in terms of productivity. As I said, we think, our product owner said we were 1,000 times more productive than we were previously. The other quote that I had from somebody else who came to work with us was basically, I used to ask for things and know that they're not going to be around for 6 months. But now I have to be really careful what I ask for because there's a really good chance it'll be in production next week. So I think in terms of turnaround, we're much more productive. In terms of defining the actual cost, it's difficult to say because there's a big impact on quality, etc. as well. So, and also one of the big benefits, I think, of pair programming is this concept of continuity in the company.
Hi. So sounds like a fantastic success story. I'm interested to know some things that didn't work or when you had a problem.
So one of the big challenges we had is some of the architectural decisions that had been made early on were quite tricky for us. So we had quite a disparate number of technologies. So the front end was actually written in PHP and Drupal, and the back end was written in Node.js. So we kind of had uber trendy and the opposite at the other end of the scale. So some of the challenges were encouraging people to actually work on both those technologies. But the pairing helped a lot there. And the other big challenge we had was a lot of third-party dependencies on libraries and things that we had to pull in because of PHP and actually because of Node.js as well. And one of the things that we absolutely ended up doing with constantly deploying things, because the test team were able to do automated deployments whenever they wanted to off the back of this, was making sure all of those third-party dependencies, we had an internal repository for them rather than relying on an external NPM and stuff like that. Last question, sorry.
How did pairing affect velocity?
So we didn't measure velocity, so it's difficult to say. One of the things that I think we talked about in the previous talk was the size of a story point can change anyway. And many people may have seen there's a great cartoon that's done the rounds on Twitter of people are saying, do you know what, we've got to increase our velocity. We've got to deliver more story points. And so the development team's standing there saying, how are we going to solve this? Smaller stories. So I can't answer that question. All I can say is, as I said, we didn't keep detailed metrics. The perception, certainly from our internal customers, was that we were going a lot faster. And not just a little bit faster, orders of magnitude faster. Okay, thank you very much.